It's good to welcome Mark Krikorian on this podcast. He's actually someone that I've wanted to have on the show for quite some time now. He serves as the executive director of the Center for Immigration Studies, and he wrote a very interesting article in Compact magazine called On Immigration, The Left but Must Learn from Cesar Chavez. Mark, welcome to the show. How are you?
You froze up there.
Okay, yeah. So how are you doing? So hope you can hear me now.
I'm doing fine. Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
All right. So we've actually met before in Budapest, Hungary. You went over here for a convention or a conference on family formation and the future. So tell me a little bit about your contribution to the conference.
Well, the point I was trying to make is that the issue of lower birth rates and problems with family formation can't be solved by immigration. We released a report about looking at, in the United States context, looking at the role immigration plays in increasing fertility, because that's often the way it's portrayed, is immigration is kind of a solution to low birth rates among the native born. We quoted Jeb Bush, a former presidential candidate, former governor of Florida, who made a big issue of promoting immigration, or wanting to promote immigration as a solution to low fertility. And the fact is, it doesn't really have that much impact because, first of all, there's a large denominator. The United States has a huge population. So immigrants would have to have either hugely higher fertility, which they don't, somewhat higher, but it's not that much higher, or there'd have to be an enormously much larger number of immigrants. And we already have a lot of immigration, and we're not going to have, triple, quadruple, quintuple the level of immigration we have now. And so, because of that, mathematically, it just doesn't increase fertility very much. The Our numbers based on 2023 numbers is that immigration increased the overall total fertility rate, is the specific statistic we looked at, increased it by 0.08 people. In other words, 8/100ths of an extra person, basically. My joke was that, it's basically like a hand and a wrist, maybe. But it's just not that big a deal. And the second part of our report was that immigration seems to actually reduce the fertility among the native born, especially among those who compete with immigrants and therefore have face higher housing prices or lower wages, and also immigration seems, through increasing diversity, seems to reduce fertility. So those are all suggestive. In other words, that's not ironclad and proven, but it seems to be pretty solid. And so in the end, it looks like whatever very modest increase in the birth rate in the United States is brought about by immigration is almost certainly totally canceled out by the reduction in native birth rates caused by immigration. So, if there are problems, and there are problems in all modern societies with regard to birth rates, you don't have to be for explosive population growth to understand that very low fertility rates are really a problem for a society. It's kind of the inverse of extremely high fertility rates. What we need, or what is easier to deal with, is basically stability, is modest fertility rates so that people replace themselves. The the factors that bring about that, and there's a lot of debate about what those are: the loss of, the decline of religion, increase of secularism, women's ability to enter the workforce and earn their own money. There's all kinds of reasons, probably some combination of a lot of those, that is causing this. But whatever the causes of lower fertility, immigration is not a solution at all. And so we need to look elsewhere. And as a final point here, using immigration as some kind of solution or presenting immigration as a solution to lower birth rates actually distracts us politically from addressing the problems that really are there, and the solutions that might follow from it, whether it's supporting more maternal leave, supporting, um, mortgages, for instance, subsidizing them for people with large families, reducing taxes you have to pay while your children are young. There's all kinds of approaches that may or may not work, but why bother exploring those and experimenting with those if the politicians just say, well, we'll import somebody else, that having babies is a job Americans won't do, and so we'll import somebody else to do it.
Okay. Well, I should also like to ask about what the Center for Immigration Studies is and what you guys' missions are.
Sure. The center is a think tank, a research policy-oriented research organization in Washington, D.C., and we're the only group like that on the side of the pro-enforcement, pro-borders, lower immigration side of the debate. There are some activist groups that also are working for tighter enforcement and tighter immigration policies, but there's no other research group. And then there are research groups on immigration, but they're all explicitly on the other side, either fostered by or funded by industry groups or the immigration lawyers lobby, that sort of thing. So our job is to make the case for tighter enforcement of immigration laws and lower levels overall of immigration. And we don't have a specific party line of what numbers are supposed to be or anything like that. But broadly speaking, our perspective is that large scale immigration, legal or illegal, is incompatible with the goals and characteristics of a modern society. And what I mean by that is that 100 or 200 years ago, in the United States, our economy was based on industry and agriculture. And a service economy, as we have now, still provides jobs for immigrants. I mean, immigrants who come here, we admit more than 1 million immigrants legally a year. They get jobs, but the opportunities for upward mobility are much more limited than they were in earlier times. We have a welfare state now. Now, compared to Europe, our welfare state is much more restrictive, but it's still, we have an extensive system of social provision for the poor, especially the working poor, especially the working poor with children, which is what immigrants are for the most part. They're working poor with children. So in the past, if you were not able to make it in the economy of that time, you went home. It was expensive to go home, but you went home. There was a lot of return migration. Now, people don't necessarily come to get welfare. That may be the case in Europe to some degree, but not in the United States. But they end up on it because if you're from Honduras, say, and you have a fourth grade education, you're not likely to be able to earn enough money to feed your own children. And so you're going to rely on the taxpayer. And in a modern society, we're not going to say, okay, your kids get to starve because you can't feed them. We're just not going to allow that. And we shouldn't. But if we're not going to allow that, then we can't allow large scale immigration. And the third area where there's this incompatibility with mass immigration and in modern conditions is in assimilation, because with transportation and communications technology so cheap and easy, I mean, we're here speaking across an ocean in real time. This kind of thing wasn't possible in the past, and that's a great thing. It's a boon, but it also means that immigrants don't really have to kind of uproot themselves and reorient their emotional and psychological connections to the new country. You can kind of live in two countries at the same time now. And again, our conversation here shows that has real benefits. It creates real problems, though, for assimilation. And so we need to essentially replace immigration with Zoom, if you will. In other words, people can still interact, but there's no reason physically immigrants have to move to other countries. They can just use Zoom.
Okay, fair enough. Um, so just one question to segue into our main topic of the day, which is Cesar Chavez. Um, I think, like it or not, the American left has been associated with the phrase open borders or the idea of the open borders. But 15 or so years ago, that was an idea of the right. So what has changed?
Well, in a sense, it's still an idea of some on the left and some on the right. There are libertarians on the right. This is specifically a kind of American idea. It's a little different from what you would in Europe refer to as liberals in Europe. That's a kind of different context. In the United States, what a libertarian means in the intellectual sense is someone who rejects the legitimacy of borders altogether and wants unlimited open trade, unlimited open immigration. Basically, they reject the idea of national sovereignty. And those people have traditionally been on the right because they also oppose high levels of taxes and government regulation. And when those issues were most salient, say in the 1980s, when Reagan came into office, libertarians were part of the rights coalition. They were eccentric. They were pro prostitution, pro drugs, all of that stuff, but they were still part of the right because the issues they agreed with the right were the most important ones. Now, what we've seen is that the size of government issues, taxes, regulation, et cetera, are still important, but they're less salient than national sovereignty, the national question. And in that sense, what's happened is that libertarians are now becoming an eccentric part of the left's coalition because the left also had diversity of views. There were pro-control people, and we're going to talk about that some, not just Cesar Chavez, but other labor leaders who were for moderate levels of immigration. But there were always people on the left who were in favor of unlimited immigration, but they were in the fringe before. Now they're the mainstream of the left. And in a sense, in the United States, and I think this is the case in Europe as well, probably in other developed, certainly in Israel, the mainstream position of the left now, it's almost a litmus test issue of the left, is against immigration controls altogether. In the United States, in particular, we saw this with the people running immigration during the Biden administration. They really didn't believe that limits on immigration were morally defensible. They saw themselves as heroic in undermining immigration law because they saw immigration law itself as immoral, as a kind of segregationist Jim Crow, holdover. And so the left has not completely shifted because these people always existed on the left, but now they are the mainstream of the left in a way that they were not before.
Okay. Well, let's talk about Cesar Chavez. How does America remember him today?
Well, Cesar Chavez today is seen as a kind of icon of Hispanic ethnic identity and chauvinism almost. The various Hispanic activist groups hold him up as some kind of paragon of Hispanic identity. And in fact, he was no such thing. He was a man of the left in the sense that he promoted worker rights and opposed big business, that sort of thing. But he was an old style leftist in the sense that he was an economic leftist, not a cultural leftist. He was advocating for the rights and for the increased bargaining power of workers in the United States. And that's why he was strongly opposed to loose enforcement of immigration laws. He would complain about it constantly, that the Border Patrol wasn't strict enough and allowed large numbers of foreign workers to come in especially when he was trying to negotiate a contract, say, with large farmers, large ag companies, to increase the wages of the workers he was representing. The big business interests would just bring in people from Mexico to undermine his efforts. And so he was, like other labor leaders in the past, strongly in favor of limits on immigration, not mistreatment of foreigners who happen to be here, but limits on the admission of new people coming in so that the labor market would tighten and that employers, in his case, agricultural employers, farmers, would have to hustle to find and keep workers rather than workers having to hustle to find and keep jobs.
Okay. Yeah, you've alluded to this earlier, but so how does a lack of control or restriction of migrants, legal or otherwise, clash with the interests of organized labor?
Well, the point of organized labor, or the point of workers banding together to to sort of equalize their power, balance their bargaining power against large employers. The point of that is to get a better deal for workers, whether it's better wages, whether it's vacation time that they don't get now, whether it's better health care, whatever it is, benefits and wages to to increase and improve. Well, simple supply and demand shows that when there are lots of workers chasing a certain number of jobs, it's employers who are in a better position. And they can say, no, we're not going to increase your wages, or no, we're not going to offer health care because there's three other people behind you who want the same job. So get lost. When the labor market is tighter, as economists put it, in other words, there's fewer workers per job, then the workers are in a position to say, look, I want this job. I'm happy to do it, but I'm going to need an extra dollar an hour over what you're offering, or I'm going to need, health care coverage, or something like that. Workers are then in a stronger position. It's supply and demand. And if there are no workers at all, obviously that becomes a problem. But the fact is, we're out of balance when we have large scale immigration. It's a kind of intervention into the labor market from outside rather than the government setting kind of the boundaries, the out of bounds line in a game, a football game or a soccer game or whatever, and then letting workers and employers kind of fight it out among themselves. What immigration is bringing in extra workers to weaken the bargaining power of the existing workers who are already there.
Okay. What would Chavez say to the current landscape of American organized labor if he was alive and still active today?
Well, it's not for me to say what he would say, but we can kind of speculate, I guess. And clearly, he was in favor of tighter immigration control and no guest worker programs and lower levels of immigration. His apologists today say that his activism on border control and immigration control was just narrowly related to strikes. In other words, when he was organizing a strike against a particular employer, that employer bringing in illegal workers from Mexico is something he was against. And he was against that. But he explicitly said it didn't really matter whether there was a strike or whether there wasn't, whether they were illegal workers or guest workers. They all undermined the bargaining power of immigrants. Now, this isn't to say he was conservative or hawkish in all respects. He actually was somewhat willing to talk about amnesty for illegal immigrants who had been here already for a long time. But again, his point was, even if you do that, you have to make sure there aren't more in the future. And that's totally opposed to today's labor movement, because until about 25 years ago, organized labor, at least represented by the big labor federation, the AFL-CIO, was in favor of tighter immigration controls. In fact, the AFL-CIO was the lead activist group in pushing against amnesty in the 1980s and for a ban on hiring illegal workers. Because until 1986, the big bill that was signed by President Reagan, until then, it was explicitly permitted in the law to hire and employ illegal immigrants. It was illegal to be an illegal alien. It was illegal to smuggle illegal aliens, but it was not illegal to employ them. Organized labor fought and won finally the effort to change that and make it unlawful. And they swallowed the amnesty of 1986 as a kind of bitter pill that they had to compromise on. Today, they've completely flipped. The main labor federation in the United States, AFL-CIO, as well as some of the other active smaller unions, are actually against the ban on hiring illegal immigrants. They want to make it legal again to hire illegal aliens. And it is, they've completely flipped and are no longer in any meaningful way promoting the interests of American workers.
Mhm. Something that is not well discussed in the current debate around immigration to America is the extent to which the flow of illegal migration from the southern border fuels the demand for border smuggling services, or colloquially known as coyotes. I think I remember that the always vocal Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez from Brooklyn or New York, she was asking like, what do you mean by coyotes? And that's a rather funny scene.
Right.
But to what extent was Chavez aware of or concerned about these sort of like human smuggling services?
Well, actually, I haven't seen anything that he'd written specifically on the smugglers, but he obviously would have opposed this. And often the smugglers were working for back then, even now, working for the very companies that he was negotiating against. So they were kind of an arm of the large employers fighting unions. But even regular illegal immigration, whether smugglers were involved or not, is something that Cesar Chavez actually took a direct hand in opposing. He had a cousin, Manuel, who was an ex-con and kind of more of a, I don't know, sort of a rougher guy than Chavez. Well, there was at one point, he actually sent his cousin Manny down to the border to organize what they at the time called a wet line, because the epithet for illegal immigrants then, and it was a normal term, now it's kind of taboo, but was wetback, which is a translation of mojado, or in Spanish, wet ones. And so Manny organized this, what they called a wet line, which was to not just deter people from crossing the border illegally, but to beat up people who didn't get the hint and tried to come anyway. I mean, they used some direct action. They had a plane that was flying and doing surveillance. They set up camps, sort of a string of camps along the border, to try to do what the Border Patrol at that time didn't really do, because the political authorities, Republican and Democrat, above them, were trying to prevent the Border Patrol from doing their job. So Chavez took a direct hand in trying to stop illegal immigration, not just talking about it or complaining about it. Another thing he did, which is less problematic. I mean, beating up people on the border is something we really don't need to do now. But he also gathered intelligence on illegal workers, in and where they were staying. So he would deliver to the Border Patrol specific information about which motel, which room number in which motel were illegal immigrants being housed by the employers he was striking against. And nothing was ever done about it. So he was not just opposed to illegal immigration, he actively worked to try to limit illegal immigration.
So, what are the views in general of Hispanic or Latino Americans on the issue of immigration, illegal or legal today?
I mean, it's obviously hard to hard to say that a group of tens of millions of people have a specific view, but clearly opinions have shifted. Hispanic Americans, and remember, most of them are Americans. They're not, aliens. They're not foreigners anymore. They are generally speaking sympathetic to immigrants just as people, but the need for real control over immigration has risen among Hispanic immigrants, Hispanic Americans, in a way that the left did not anticipate. And frankly, some people on the right didn't anticipate either. And so what we've seen is a real shift, a real hardening of opinion among all Americans, but also among Hispanic Americans on the issue of immigration. And we've seen that most dramatically in South Texas, where there are counties down there which are overwhelmingly, and I'm talking about 95%, 97% Hispanic in origin. And that whole area of South Texas. The Rio Grande Valley is the way it's referred to, even though it's only part of the Rio Grande, is in a sense sort of culturally Hispanic in a way that parts of Louisiana are Cajuns parts of Pennsylvania are Amish. In other words, it's a regional culture that has a kind of overwhelming influence. But those counties which have been voting overwhelmingly Democrat for generations shifted significantly in the past several elections, such that Trump actually carried some of these 95, 97% Hispanic counties. There's not a huge number of people, they're relatively small population, but these people are patriotic Americans. They're culturally, in many ways, Hispanic, Mexican origin, but they're not politically Mexican in some sense. They're patriotic Americans. And what the populist rising that Trump has taken advantage of really is driven by, in my opinion, is a patriotic concern for us rather than for others. In other words, a sense that the government hasn't been looking after the interests of our people. And that's something that's shared by large numbers of Hispanics, as the election results are showing. So this is something that has confounded the left, which figured that any group that isn't, quote, white, unquote, is going to vote for them. And it's kind of confounded some people on the right, or at least among Republicans, kind of moderate Republicans, who thought that the Republican Party had to become open borders like the Democrats in order to attract Hispanics. Both of those groups were wrong. And Trump was right. And it's a encouraging development for the kind of the unity of the American people, that Hispanic Americans are not some kind of fifth column group or some kind of unassimilable minority, which is something that, frankly, that Europeans may face with regard to different immigrant groups. But with regard to America's largest immigrant group, Latin Americans, and among them, Mexican origin people are the largest group, assimilation, is proceeding slower than it should, slower than it would with less immigration. But it does seem to be, it's not hopeless. Let me put it that way.
Okay. Now, another element of Chauvet's thinking that would offend his admirers today is his opposition to the notion of La Raza, as you've mentioned in the article. So tell me what that idea is and was he opposed to it?
La Raza means the race in Spanish. And essentially, what it represents is a kind of ethnic chauvinism, an idea that there should be a kind of political solidarity, and Hispanics should all think the same way. The origins of the idea are actually kind of appalling. There was a Mexican intellectual back in the 30s who developed this idea of La Raza Cosmica, the cosmic race. And the point of it was to oppose white supremacist ideas coming out of Europe, Nazi type ideas. And it was, in a sense, kind of just the other side of the coin, because the concept was that, whites aren't racially superior. Mestizos are racially superior. In other words, Mexicans who are a mix of Spanish and Indian. That's what mestizo means, mixed. And the point of Vasconcelos was the guy, the intellectual in Europe, who in Mexico, who came up with this idea, was that people of mixed origin are biologically superior to others. It was essentially Nazism with a different twist. And the Hispanic chauvinist groups, starting in the 60s, kind of trying to model themselves on the Black Power movement in the United States, adopted this idea. And there's, in fact, one of the leading activist groups in the United States, which got its start when Chavez was around, was called the National Council of La Raza. And the name, the stench of the racism of the name, they resisted, they stuck to it until finally, a few years ago, they finally gave in and changed the name of the organization. It's called Unidos US now. But at the time, Chavez explicitly said that this La Raza concept was the Hitler concept. He actually said that several times, that it started out as being anti-white, but it would eventually become anti-everything. And so his point was, and Chavez was he was a deeply pious Catholic, and he believed in the value of all human beings. He wasn't fighting against the white man. He was fighting against big businesses that took advantage of the workers he represented, most of whom were Mexican American, but not all of them. The early farm worker movement included Filipinos, because there were Filipino farm workers, because the United States had governed the Philippines as a colony for about 50 years. And so there was a significant number of Filipino workers who were also farm workers, whom Chavez clearly, explicitly saw himself as representing their interests too. So it's ironic that a kind of trans-ethnic activist, in other words, one who was like Chavez, who was promoting the interests of working class people, regardless of their ethnic origin, has become this kind of ethnic chauvinist poster child, mascot, if you will. And it's not something that he would ever have condoned.
Certainly. Yeah. To what extent is the notion of La Raza still popular amongst Hispanic Americans today?
Yeah, I think it was never all that popular. And you have to differentiate here between a kind of normal ethnic pride. There are Hispanic Americans. Well, there's a variety of different Hispanic Americans, but they have various traditions and food ways and this sort of thing that they are attached to and want to pass on to their kids. And that's just normal and healthy. You have to differentiate that from a kind of political ethnicity, which is what this La Raza idea is that Hispanic Americans are a kind of distinct, racially distinct political element within the United States and have to act that way. That's not very popular. I'm not sure it ever was popular. It's really something more that college educated the college educated Hispanic elites that frankly may not even be all that connected to normal Hispanic community life in the sense of, going to church and the rest of it. That's who it was popular among. And you can see that in a bunch of ways. First of all, the huge political shift toward Donald Trump. because and Republicans in general, which kind of represents is a sense among Hispanic voters that they're regular Americans and they're voting based on their economic and other interests. But also, you see that, for instance, in intermarriage. If there was this La Raza idea had resonance among Hispanic Americans, then why is intermarriage so high? The fact is, Hispanics kind of represent a further expansion of who Americans think is part of the mainstream. They're entering the mainstream rather than, in fact, I think we're always in the mainstream rather than being seen as minorities. A long time ago, if you in the 1600s, if you were English Protestant in Massachusetts, but the wrong kind of English Protestant, you were not part of the mainstream if you were Quaker. And that's expanded over the generations, and such that Hispanics, especially those who were born here, speak English without an accent and have a regular job. Nobody really thinks of them as minorities anymore, except the government and these La Raza chauvinists. Ordinary people, just whether Hispanic or non-Hispanic, don't really view the issue that way anymore.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I think that speaks to another effect of, mass migration too, is that if it comes from, say, one particular place or region, then the people who arrive in a new country, say the United States, will perpetuate this kind of enclave mentality. We've seen that with, Irish people and Italian people. Thankfully, they've managed to assimilate themselves. But that is an effect that I don't think the open borders crowd want to acknowledge.
No, they certainly don't, because the open borders people don't understand, human nature. Of course, you're going to want to stick together with people who you're familiar with. I mean, how could it be otherwise? But if numbers are lower, that's harder to do. So that, to use a particularly telling example, in the United States, we have lots of Somali immigrants in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It's a long story about why they ended up there, but the fact is Minneapolis is like the Somali capital, if you will, of the United States. If there were 3 or 4 Somali families, just that, in Minneapolis, it wouldn't make much difference. They would have to kind of accommodate themselves to the larger community. If there's 3,000 or 30,000 Somali families in Minneapolis, then they do create a kind of enclave that's much more difficult to assimilate. And to some degree, we've seen that with Hispanics. Our immigration has been mostly Hispanic for a long time, although before Biden came into office, it was actually shifting and new immigration was becoming mostly from Asia. But and so that phenomenon of taking an excessive share, in my opinion, of immigration from one country, Mexico, or one cultural region, Latin America, did in fact slow assimilation. There's no question about it. And so the difference, though, in our experience compared to Europe, is that our immigration, even though in my opinion there has been too much of it, clearly, and it's been too concentrated, is coming mainly from Christian Latin America, so that there isn't the same cultural distance between the receiving society, our country, and the newcomers as there is in Europe with, say, Afghans or West Africans or what have you, where the cultural distance, just objectively speaking, is dramatically greater. And so assimilation is dramatically more difficult.
Right. So you alluded to Cesar Chavez's Catholic faith. What do you believe is the impact, so to speak, or the influence that his Catholic faith has on his activism, his political philosophy?
Well, he clearly saw himself as, you know, a sort of an advocate for the poor in both a political sense, but also he approached that issue through a religious prism. And this is one of the reasons I think Bobby Kennedy, for instance, Robert Kennedy, RFK Jr.'s father, was so um, interested in advocating for his concerns because they saw this as a kind of, and I think Chavez himself saw what he was doing as kind of what in church theology is sometimes referred to as the preferential option for the poor. In other words, that the poor are, especially powerless, and that we should be going kind of out of our way to help them. Now, that can be taken too far. I'm no expert on liberation theology in Latin America, which was a widespread idea, and conceivably Chavez was that liberation theology resonated with him. But the fact is, it's pretty clear that his religious background is what um, informed much of his labor activism in a way that is not true, even then was not true with a lot of non-Catholic activists that he worked with, Saul Alinsky and other people who were either atheists or Jewish, and did not really approach it in the same way. And I think part of that is the reason we see a different tack among the left today, among the labor activist left, because they're secular, uh, and so don't really approach the issue from a Christian perspective, and so that can lead to the kind of ethnic chauvinism, for instance, that Christianity by definition opposes. As St. Paul wrote, there is neither Greek nor Jew, neither bond nor free in Christ Jesus, and uh, Chavez took that seriously. The modern labor movement does not.
Okay. Well, I'd like to end on this note. How does lower levels of immigration benefit the immigrant?
Obviously, the immigrants who don't get to come, it doesn't benefit. This is the argument that people are often making, that a Haitian immigrant coming to the United States sees his, income improve, and that's true. But those immigrants we do let in are in a better position if there are fewer new people following them, because they don't undermine their job prospects. They don't compete for housing in immigrant neighborhoods. They don't compete for social services that yesterday's immigrants are taking advantage of or might need. And frankly, it slows the process of their children's upward mobility, of the children of yesterday's immigrants. Their upward mobility opportunities are undermined by tomorrow's ongoing immigration. And in fact, immigration policy should be based on what's good for our children, not what worked for our parents. And so, obviously, a lower level of immigration, a more moderate level of immigration, is in the interest of those immigrants we do actually decide to let in.
Okay. I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Mark
Good.
Krikorian, for joining the show.
Thank you.